me, but I'm going to be reading from Mark chapter 16, verse 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
Well, happy Easter, everybody. Many of you may be wondering why Bryton only read verses 1 through 8 of that last chapter of Mark. And the reason is because many people are really uncertain that Mark wrote the last 11 verses of his gospel, verses 9 through 20. In fact, the majority of scholars believe that Mark did not write these verses because they don't match his style. They don't match the way that he wrote and all these different things. And so, and I actually used to be convinced that Mark ended at verse 8 for literary reasons. However, I have since changed my ideas on that, and we'll talk about that more at the end. But regardless of what happened here at the end of Mark's gospel, we still have the most important part of the story. So let's walk through this. If you've got your Bibles open, you can follow along, even though I'm not going to be reading word for word, since Bryton already did that for us. We have three women, two Marys and Salome. They were all at the crucifixion. At the burial, we find the two Marys, and Salome is not there at the burial. And the only explanation I have for that is that she's probably collapsed somewhere out of grief and mourning and just could not follow Jesus' body to the tomb as Joseph of Arimathea buried the body. And so the Sabbath day comes to an end, Saturday comes to an end, and they purchase spices after sundown, and they head out to the tomb at first light, and they're talking about a problem that they're anticipating that they might have. They're not going to be able to move the rock away from the tomb, so what are they going to do? Well, they're probably thinking, well, we hope that there's somebody there who can help us. We hope that we can get this tomb open so that we can go ahead with what is called in their culture the primary burial. And the reason that they're going to bury this body, the reason that they're going to wrap this body in linens and burial spices and all these things is because most tombs were group tombs. There would be many people that would be buried in one tomb. And so they would go to the tomb and they would wrap the body in spices and cloth to cut down on the smell, because there's going to be more people coming in with more bodies later on, and they didn't want the stench to be just overpowering. And so they would wrap these bodies in these linens and spices so that the smell wouldn't be too overpowering for the people who would be coming into the tomb afterwards. And once the tomb was filled up, then the rock would be sealed, and they would let the bodies decompose, and they would come in after a certain amount of time, and they would collect the bones and put the bones into what's called an ossuary, which is a little box, and this would be the secondary burial. And so the women are going to offer Jesus a service to bury his body officially, primarily. And when they arrive at the tomb, they receive the shock of their lives. There's a young man sitting just to the right of where Jesus' body had lain. And two of these women had seen Jesus' body laid there. And here's this young man with just dressed all in white, and he is sitting beside the place where Jesus' body was, and Jesus' body is not there. It's gone. And he speaks to them. He says, "Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who is crucified. He isn't here. He is risen from the dead. Look, this is where they laid his body. Now go and tell his disciples, including Peter, that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee, and you will see him there just as he told you before he died." Man, this is such a beautiful picture right here, okay? It's so beautiful because Jesus had told them just a few days earlier as they were on their way from celebrating the Passover to the Garden of Gethsemane. They were on their way, and Jesus told them that the shepherd was going to be struck and he was going to die. But after he was raised, he would meet them in Galilee. He told them this on the way to the Garden of Gethsemane. And even after Peter denies Jesus, even after the other disciples run away, they are overcome by fear, they abandon him, he maintains his promise. He still has plans for them, even after their denial, their fear, and their abandonment. It's not the end for them. And somebody watching this today needs to hear this, because you have walked away from Jesus. You maybe have denied Jesus. Maybe you have allowed fear to cause you to abandon or run away or leave him. But let me tell you something. God still has plans for you. Maybe somebody today needs to hear that. Jesus says, I made a promise, and I am going to keep it. But then the most reliable manuscripts of our New Testament end in this one verse, which is so strange. Verse 8. The women fled from the tomb, trembling and bewildered, and they said nothing to anyone because they were too frightened. This is so strange. It's such a weird ending, because if there's anybody who has remained faithful throughout the whole thing, if there's anybody who has stayed with Jesus to the end, it was these women, and now suddenly they run away and they're gone and they're too frightened to tell anybody, and the story ends. How strange is that? Such a strange ending. It doesn't make sense that Mark would include the promise of chapter 14 where Jesus said that he would meet his disciples in Galilee, but then he doesn't tell the story about their meeting in Galilee. It doesn't make sense. You know, some scholars argue because of this that the original scroll, or one of the earliest copies, actually got mangled, or the last part of the scroll got ripped off, and that the scribes just copied what they had then. Other scholars say that Mark ended at verse 8 for literary reasons. And this is what I used to believe, but I'm no longer convinced of that. So regardless of why the original part of Mark ends at verse 8, it still does something for us. And here's what it does. It tells us that this is not the end, because the tomb is empty and a dead man rose from the dead. This is not the end, right? It's not the end. You see, Mark's gospel leaves us with a dilemma. There's a blank at the end of the gospel after the resurrection, and the question that we immediately have is, how are we going to fill the blank? How are you going to fill the blank? Do we take Easter for granted? Are we appropriately awestruck at this wonderful and inspiring yet strange work of God? But let me tell you something. This is not the end, because the tomb is empty and a dead man rose from the dead. That's why the story's not over. And let me tell you something. We need to hear this more than ever today, because right now, in the midst of a viral pandemic in our world, You need to hear, I need to hear, we all need to hear that this is not the end, because the tomb is empty and a dead man rose from the dead. And what I want to encourage all of us to do from this point on is to go and live. Go and live like there is more to this life than simply living and dying. There's more to this life. There's something that is more meaningful than just this stuff that we have around us. Let's live as if the story depends upon us continuing it. You see, this is not the end, because the tomb is empty and a dead man rose from the dead. Go and be blessed.